Welcome to today's story. This is a moment to set aside the noise of the outside world and step into a new journey with me. If this story brings you emotion or relaxation, please support the channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing. I truly appreciate your presence and support. And now, let's begin the story. The first thing Martin Hale heard that night was not the storm. It was the lighthouse bell. The old brass bell hung above the workbench in the lantern room, where it had been useless for nearly 30 years. It had no wire leading to it. No sensor. No reason to move. But at 2 in the morning, with rain striking the glass in hard silver sheets and the wind bending the grass on Saint Orra flat against the cliffs, the bell gave one thin, trembling ring. Martin looked up from the open panel beneath the main lamp. For a moment, he did not move. The whole tower shivered around him in familiar ways. The lens clicked as it turned. The generator below gave its tired, uneven growl. Water drummed on the roof. Those were normal sounds. The bell was not. Then it rang again. Martin wiped his hands on a rag and crossed the lantern room. He had spent most of his life listening to machines tell him what was wrong. A pump complained differently from an engine. A loose cable had its own faint, nervous buzz. A bad bearing made a sound that carried through metal like a bad toothache. The bell was answering a vibration in the old emergency receiver. He bent over the receiver cabinet near the window. The device was older than the beacon network by several generations. It had been left in the lighthouse after the Coastal Authority replaced every official channel with Meridian Beacon's automated grid. Martin kept it because old equipment was useful when new equipment failed, and because no one had paid him enough to throw anything away. A narrow strip of light pulsed across the receiver. 3 short flashes. 2 long. 1 short. Martin's hand stopped above the dial. That was not weather noise. He listened again. The bell rang in the same rhythm through the metal case. Weak but precise. "Who are you?" he said quietly. The official panel mounted beside it gave a clean blue blink, warning that atmospheric interference had been detected and advising against a manual response. Martin stared at the words. Then he looked out through the wet glass. Saint Orra was a small island off Earth's western coast, a hard place of black rock, narrow fields, and weather that could turn from rain to sleet before dawn. It sat beside an approved sea approach used by small civilian craft arriving from orbit. Wealthier ships never came close to Saint Orra. They used the bright, guarded ports farther south. The island saw fishing boats, freight barges, and the occasional damaged vessel that had nowhere better to go. Martin had been told the lighthouse would close after winter. The letter was still on the table downstairs, pinned beneath a tin of screws so the draft would not blow it away. The Coastal Authority called the light redundant. Meridian Beacon could guide everything from orbit. The island did not need a keeper. It did not need a lantern room. It did not need Martin. The official panel blinked again with the same warning. Outside, high above the storm clouds, another weak light answered. Martin saw it only because he had been watching the sea and sky long enough to notice what did not belong. It was not lightning. Lightning came down or crawled sideways through clouds. This light moved in a broken line, then vanished, then appeared again lower and farther north. He reached for the old signal key. The receiver pulsed. 3 short. 2 long. 1 short. It was a distress call. An old maritime pattern adapted for low-power orbital landings. Any pilot trained before the network era would know it, and any keeper who had worked rescue waters would know how to answer. Martin had worked rescue waters for 27 years. He pressed the key and sent back the same pattern. The official panel chimed sharply, logging his manual interference and ordering him to stop transmitting. Martin ignored it. He sent the pattern again, then leaned toward the glass. Another light appeared, then another, then 5 more. They were too close together, much too close. His stomach tightened. He ran down the spiral stairs, one hand on the rail. The tower smelled of salt, old paint, damp stone, and fuel. At the bottom, he crossed the small room where he slept. A blanket lay folded on a narrow bed. A pot of stew sat on the stove, cold now. Beside the stove was the last fuel receipt he had not paid. He opened the weather map on the wall. The storm had pushed a field of electromagnetic pressure over the sea approach. Meridian's main corridor should have shifted traffic east, away from Saint Orra's reefs, unless someone had been pushed west. Martin grabbed his oilskin coat, a hand lamp, and the old harbor radio. He stepped into the rain. The village below the lighthouse was dark, except for a few windows. Saint Orra slept early because most people rose before dawn. Its fishing fleet was old, its income uncertain, and its houses had been repaired so many times that every wall seemed to hold the memory of another winter. Martin ran downhill toward the small dock. By the time he reached the boat shed, he had called Norah Pike, the island's harbor mechanic, and Jace Miller, who owned the only working towboat besides Martin's. Both answered with the sleepy anger of people who knew Martin did not call at 2 in the morning unless something had gone very wrong. "What have you got?" Norah asked when she arrived, hair tucked under a wool cap. "Ship's coming down through the storm," Martin said. "Not on a proper line. Meridian says anything. They say it is interference." Norah looked up at the sky. "And you believe them?" Martin did not answer. He pointed. A light broke through the lower cloud layer. It was shaped wrong for a falling star and too slow for a freight craft. It moved in a shaky arc, with 4 more lights behind it. Then the first light blinked. 3 short, 2 long, 1 short. Jace arrived at a run, dragging on his coat. He was younger than Martin, broad-shouldered, with a face that always looked tired from working too many tides. He looked at the sky, then at Martin. "How many?" "At least 6. Maybe more." "Can they land?" "Not where they're going." The old harbor radio crackled. A clean, synthetic voice spoke through the static. "Saint Orra Marine District. This is Meridian Beacon Traffic Control. You are instructed to keep all unauthorized vessels clear of the coast. Do not activate legacy guidance equipment. Civilian arrivals are being managed." Martin took the microphone. "Managed where?" There was a pause. "Traffic data is restricted. Those ships are headed for the reef shelf. Your assessment is not required." Martin looked at Norah. She had heard it too. He set the microphone down. "Get the towboat ready." Jace hesitated. "Martin, if they're from orbit and they come down wrong, we cannot just pull them in like a broken trawler." "No," Martin said, "but we can show them where the water is deep enough to try." Norah grabbed the radio. "What do you need?" "Every lamp that still works." "Flares." "The spare floats from the shed." "The red reflectors from the north marker." "That is half the harbor." "Then use half the harbor." They worked without another word. Martin climbed back to the lighthouse as Norah and Jace woke the village. He restarted the old generator, bypassing the automatic limiter that Meridian had ordered installed 2 years earlier. The machine protested. The whole tower shivered as it took the extra load. He opened the protective shutters around the main lens. The light had not been used at full strength in years. When Martin pulled the lever, the lamp woke with a low, deep hum. The beam cut through rain and cloud, not toward the open sea, but upward, angled along the forgotten emergency descent line that old pilots used before Meridian owned the sky. The first ship answered. It came through the clouds like something barely holding itself together. Its hull was narrow and patched with sheets of different metal. 2 small craft were tethered to either side by cables. Behind it, another battered vessel followed, so close that Martin could see the rope linking their tails. They were not flying in formation for safety. They were tied together because they had no other way to share power. The lead craft flashed its lights toward the lighthouse. Martin turned the lens in a slow, deliberate pattern. Left for deep water, right for the safe curve around the reef, then hold when the wind crossed the channel. The ship tried to follow. A burst of blue static tore across the sky. The lead craft lurched. Martin swore under his breath and looked at the official panel. A new warning had appeared, reporting an unauthorized arrival and an active guidance override. "Meridian is pushing them," he said. He grabbed the manual wheel and forced the lens farther west. It was heavy. His shoulder burned. The old gears complained, but the beam moved. Below, the village lights began to blink in response. Norah had placed lamps along the shore. Jace's towboat was moving out of the harbor, its deck lights swinging through rain. Other boats followed, smaller and slower. The lead alien craft dropped below the cloud line. Martin could see its windows now, faces pressed against them. Some were pale under the cabin lights. Some were motionless. The ship tipped toward the reef. Martin sent a hard sequence with the light. Stop. Turn. Hold. For one breathless second, nothing happened. Then the ship changed course. It came down toward the dark water beyond the harbor mouth. One of the tethered craft broke free and spun away. Jace, Martin said into the radio. Second pod is loose. North side. Do not let it hit the rocks. Already moving. The lead ship struck the sea with a sound like metal hitting a drum. A burst of spray rose higher than the harbor lamps. It skidded, turned, and nearly rolled. Martin ran down the tower again. By the time he reached the dock, the first alien craft was drifting toward the shallow channel. Its side was torn. Steam rose from a vent near the rear. Jace had a line on it, but the towboat was being dragged sideways by the current. Martin climbed aboard without asking. You should be at the light, Jace said. The light knows what to do for 10 minutes. You need another pair of hands. The wind hit them as they cleared the harbor wall. Martin grabbed the cable, looped it around the reinforced post, and watched the movement of the damaged craft. Not there, he shouted. If we pull straight, we rip the side open. Bring us around its nose. Jace swore but turned the wheel. They made the first craft fast to the dock just before another wave drove it toward the pilings. Nora and half the village were waiting with ropes, blankets, and tools. Hey! Hatch opened with a hiss. The first person through was not what Martin expected. She was tall and narrow, with dark hair braided tightly against her head and skin the color of warm copper under the harsh harbor lights. One sleeve was soaked with something darker than rain. Her face was drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes moved quickly over the dock, the water, the boats, the people. She did not ask for help. She pointed at the sky. Two more are still out there, she said in clear, strained English. One has medical sleepers. One is children and elders. Please. Martin nodded once. My name is Martin Hale. This is Saint Orra. Stay here if you can stand. My name is Sarenvale. She caught the railing when the ship shifted. I can stand. Then tell me where the next one is. She looked toward the storm. Her hand shook, but her voice did not. Northwest. It lost its stabilizer. It will follow the wrong light if Meridian still has control. Martin met her eyes. Then we give it a better light. For the next 2 hours, Saint Orra did not sleep. Martin moved between the towboat, the lighthouse radio, and the harbor. Saren stayed near him whenever she could, reading the approach angles of the alien craft and shouting corrections over the wind. Her knowledge was exact, practical, and immediate. She knew which lights meant a ship had enough power to turn. She knew how to identify a failing pressure seal by the color of the venting vapor. She knew that the smallest pods needed to be brought in first because their heat cells would die before dawn. Doran Pell emerged from the first craft with a limp and a wrench clutched in one hand. He was older than Saren, broad in the shoulders, his gray hair tied low at his neck. He took one look at Martin's generator cable and said, "That joint will melt." "It has held for 20 years, Martin said. "It is melting now." Martin looked. Doran was right. "Come with me," Martin said. They ran back to the tower together. Doran did not waste time asking permission. He knelt beside the generator, inspected the cable, and began stripping insulation with a small tool from his belt. Martin found a length of copper braid from an old emergency circuit. Together, they bridged the failing connection while the lighthouse beam kept turning above them. "Your lamp is older than my grandfather," Doran said. "Your ship looks older than my first truck." Doran gave a short laugh. "Then both have earned respect." In the harbor, Mara Sol organized the wounded in the net shed. She was smaller than Saren, with a soft voice that did not carry far, but somehow made people listen. She directed islanders to place the coldest refugees near the stove, to keep the pressure-sensitive cases upright, to boil water and not touch the blue bandages until she explained how they worked. Eli Bran, a young man with a bruised face and a torn coat, carried blankets from house to house. At first he moved like someone waiting to be told to leave. Then a little island boy handed him a coil of rope, and Eli took it without speaking and went back to the dock. By dawn, 7 craft had reached Saint Orra, including the loose pod Jace had pulled clear of the rocks. Not all of them were intact. One lay half submerged in the shallow channel. held by 3 ropes and the stubbornness of 6 exhausted people. Another had lost its outer plating, but the people inside were alive. That should have been enough for Martin to feel relief. Instead, as gray morning light spread over the island, Saren placed a folded sheet of real paper on the work table in the lighthouse kitchen. It was covered in lines and marks. Some followed the official descent corridors, while others had been scratched out. Beside them were names, dates, and brief notes written in a careful hand. No return signal. Diverted after a fee hold. Breach near the shelf. Missing. Martin looked up. What is this? Saren stood with both hands around a cup of tea she had not touched. A map of ships that asked for help, she said, and of the places Meridian Beacon sent them instead. Martin looked back at the paper. There were more marks than he could count. The storm had passed, but Saint Orra was not safe. Not anymore. By noon, the island had become a shelter because no one had planned for it not to be. The net shed was crowded with blankets, heating lamps, borrowed mattresses, and the smell of salt water mixed with soup. The island clinic had 2 beds and 1 exhausted nurse, so Mara turned a storage room into a quiet space for those who could not bear noise. Doran helped repair a water pump that had been failing for months. Eli and 3 other refugees carried crates from the dock as if they had lived on Saint Orra all their lives. Martin walked through it all with a notebook in his hand, counting. Fuel, water, food, medicines, blankets, working lamps. He hated counting because numbers made the hard things plain. Saint Orra had enough dry food for 6 days if everyone ate carefully. Enough fuel for 4 if the cold returned. Enough medicine for the island's usual needs, but not for 50 extra people with burns, lung damage, and untreated infections. Nora found him outside the shed. Tell me you have a plan, she said. I have a list. That is not the same thing. No. She looked toward the refugees. The freight barge due tomorrow. I called. Meridian froze its clearance. Nora's face hardened. They can do that. They already did. Martin held up his harbor radio. A message had come an hour earlier. No cargo vessel was permitted to dock at Saint Orra, while unauthorized off-world arrivals remained on the island. The message did not call the refugees criminals. It did not need to. It called them a traffic irregularity. An irregularity had no face, no mother, no injured hand, no child asleep under a borrowed coat. Saren joined them, moving carefully because her arm was bandaged from wrist to elbow. I heard, she said. Martin turned. You should be resting. There are people who need oxygen checks. Marana knows how to do them. I need to speak with you. Nora folded her arms. About the map? Sarah nodded. They went into the lighthouse kitchen. Rainwater still ticked from Martin's coat where he had hung it by the stove. The paper map lay on the table beneath a chipped mug. Saren did not sit. I worked at a Meridian Beacon relay station, she said. Not one of the large ones. A small station near a mining belt. I monitored civilian descent lanes. I checked warnings. I reported failed tags. Martin listened. At first, I thought the reroutes were errors. A storm warning would appear. Then low-tier ships would receive a new path. It was always farther out. Always through regions that had fewer rescue stations. I reported it. The reply said the routes were approved alternatives. Approved by whom? I never knew. The system did not show names. It showed priority categories: gold traffic, silver traffic, basic traffic, and relief traffic. Which were you? Basic. And these ships? Below basic. Her voice remained steady, but her fingers tightened against the table. They did not have enough credit for the lowest live guidance tier. When a corridor was crowded, they were moved first. Nora stared at the map. Moved where? Where they would not delay anyone important. The room went quiet. Martin looked at a cluster of marks near Saint Orra's approach lane. Why come here? Because this is one of the old routes. The route your lighthouse used before Meridian took over. I found references in abandoned records. I thought if we reached Earth, maybe there would be old keepers. Old stations. Someone who still understood a call, made without a subscription. You thought right, Martin said. Saren looked at him, and for the first time something in her face gave way. Not tears. Not yet. Just a brief, stunned look of someone who had expected a door to stay closed and found it open. A sound outside cut through the moment. The harbor radio began to ring. Nora answered it. Her expression changed as she listened. "They're sending a recovery vessel," she said. Martin took the microphone. "This is Saint Orra." A man's voice answered. Calm, low, professionally polite. "Martin Hale. My name is Kellen Voss. I represent Meridian Beacon. I am approaching your harbor under emergency authority. We need to discuss the unauthorized arrivals." Martin looked through the window. Far beyond the gray water, a long dark ship sat just beyond the storm line. It was not armed in any obvious way. It did not need to be. Its message had already cut off Saint Orra's food. Kellen Voss arrived after sunset. He came ashore in a small launch with 2 crew members who carried sealed cases and a portable screen. He wore a dark coat that did not show rain. His boots were clean. His hair was silver at the temples, his expression controlled. Martin met him at the end of the dock. Nora stood at Martin's side. Saren waited farther back, beneath the harbor lamp, with Doran and Mara near her. Kellen looked over the island with mild interest, as though he had come to inspect a property. "Martin Hale," he said. "Thank you for receiving me. I did not invite you." "No, but you did activate an unlicensed emergency light and bring multiple unregistered vessels into an active maritime corridor. They were in trouble. They were outside their permitted route." Martin said nothing. Kellen opened one of the cases. Inside was a tablet displaying forms and official seals. Meridian Beacon is prepared to take custody of the arrivals. They will receive transport, medical screening, and resettlement support. Saint Orra's freight clearance will be restored immediately. Your Lighthouse closure review will also be reconsidered. Nora made a sound that was almost a laugh. "You are offering him his own job back for handing over people you pushed into the sea." Kellen looked at her. "I understand emotions are high. Do you? I understand resources are limited. Your island has elderly residents, a clinic with inadequate supplies, a winter weather pattern approaching. You cannot safely support this number of people." Martin looked at the dark ship offshore. "Where are you taking them?" he asked. "To a relocation center." Saren stepped forward. "Which one?" Kellen's eyes rested on her. He knew her name. Martin could see it. "Saren Vale," he said. "You have made this more difficult than necessary." "Which center?" Saren asked again. Kellen touched the tablet. A list appeared. Saren read it. Her face went still. "Those are labor settlements," she said. "They are regulated employment zones. They are debt camps." "That is an imprecise term." "It is the correct term." Kellen's voice did not change. "The settlements offer work, shelter, and structured repayment, better than drifting in unauthorized craft." Mara moved closer to Saren. Eli looked down at the dock planks. Martin had seen people speak about hardship, as if hardship was a choice made by those suffering from it. Kellen did it smoothly. He did not need to raise his voice because the power behind him was already doing the talking. Martin said, "They stay here tonight." Kellen smiled without warmth. "Of course. But Saint Orra has 3 days of fuel clearance remaining. Perhaps you should speak with your community before deciding what is best for everyone." He turned and walked back toward the launch. At the end of the dock, he paused. "Martin Hale. Some lights are old for a reason. They cost more to keep alive than they are worth." Martin watched him leave. That night, no one on Saint Orra slept well. The wind had weakened, but the sea still struck the harbor wall with a dull, patient force. In a net shed, the borrowed blankets did little against the damp. The island clinic nurse, a woman named Beth Rowan, moved from cot to cot with Mara beside her, checking temperatures and breathing rates. Martin brought in a crate of old heaters from the Lighthouse storeroom. Only 2 worked. He opened the third on the floor, found a corroded contact, and cleaned it with the edge of a pocket knife while Mara held the lamp. "You should rest," she said. "So should you. I rested on a ship that had no heat. I am difficult to impress now." Martin glanced at her. Mara's expression did not change, but there was tired humor in her voice. The heater clicked once, then gave off a narrow stream of warm air. Mara moved it beside a small alien boy who was sleeping against his mother's shoulder. The child was not crying. That was worse somehow. He was too exhausted to cry. "His name is Run," Mara said. "His mother is Lisa." She worked in a mineral wash plant. When the plant closed, the company kept their housing until they could pay the travel fee. They never could. Martin looked at the boy, then at the thin strip of light beneath the shed door. What happened to his father? Mara's hands paused over a blanket. His father took a night route to find work. The beacon changed his path. We have no body. No answer. Only a message that said weather conditions were severe. Martin had heard words like that his whole life. Weather conditions were severe. Mechanical failure. Operator error. Phrases that turned grief into paperwork. He went back to work on the fourth heater. Near midnight, Saren came into the shed carrying the paper map. She looked worse than she had at the harbor. The strain of holding everyone together had begun to show in the way she stood, as if her spine had become one more thing she had to keep from failing. "Martin," she said, "there is something else." He followed her outside. The rain had stopped, though mist still moved through the harbor lights. She opened the map on a crate. "This mark," she said, pointing to a place just north of Saint Orra Lane. "A worker transport vanished here 8 months ago. There were 112 people aboard." Martin looked at the date. Why does that matter now? Because the route that sent them there was generated from this relay sector. The same local system that pushed us west. She traced a line. Meridian will say the storm caused the diversion. But the reroute was entered before the storm reached the corridor. Martin looked at the tiny handwritten symbols beside the line. "Can you prove that?" "Not with the map alone." Saren pulled a small metal capsule from inside her coat. "I copied the relay timestamps. I hid them in a mechanical memory chip because digital archives get revised. But the chip is damaged. I have not been able to read all of it." "Can Doran?" "Maybe. He says the contacts are dry. He needs a clean current and a stable reader." Martin thought of the Lighthouse workshop. "Come on." They crossed the sleeping island and entered the tower through the side door. Martin led Saren down to the small electronics bench he had kept from his rescue days. It was not much. A magnifier, a signal reader, wire, solder, and a cabinet full of parts no one else wanted. Doran arrived 10 minutes later, leaning on his cane and carrying his tool roll. "You called," he said. "Can you read this?" Saren asked. Doran held the chip under the lamp. "Maybe." For an hour, the three of them worked in low voices. Martin cleaned the reader pins. Doran adjusted a contact plate. Saren held the chip steady whenever the connection flickered. At last, a line of data appeared on the old screen. Then another. The information was plain enough even without technical knowledge. A route had been marked low priority. A premium commercial vessel had entered the corridor. The worker transport had been diverted into a weather shelf. Its automatic distress flag had been delayed. The entry was approved by a code that no longer existed in the public record. Doran stared at the screen. "That is not an accident," he said. "No, c'est un guisperth." Martin looked at the timestamps again. The transport had called for help for 47 minutes before the system had recorded its emergency status. 47 minutes. Long enough for someone to choose. He understood then why Kellen Voss had come himself. The map was not only proof of suffering. It was proof that someone had built a system where suffering had a place in the schedule. A floorboard creaked behind them. Eli stood in the doorway. He had heard enough. "My sister was on that transport," he said. No one spoke. Eli stared at the screen as if it might change if he looked hard enough. His face had gone pale. "You told us it was a storm," he said to Saren. "I did not know then," Saren said. "I knew the route was wrong. I did not know the delay was deliberate." "You worked there?" "Yes. Ilias mist stiten it." For a moment, Martin thought he might strike the screen, or Saren, or the wall. Instead, he turned and walked out. Saren took a step after him, then stopped. Martin said, "Give him a minute. What if he does not come back? Then he has a right to leave the room angry." Saren looked down at the chip. "I kept telling myself that saving one ship mattered. Then another. I thought if I had enough names, someone would listen." Martin put a hand on the workbench. Someone listened tonight. Before the island could begin arguing over what came next, Martin took the damaged memory chip to the net shed and showed it only to Nora, Mara, Doran, and Eli. Eli did not forgive Saren. Not then, but he did sit beside the heater near Run and Lisa. When the little boy woke, Eli gave him the last orange from his own ration bag. It was a small thing. On Saint Orra, small things were often the first proof that someone had chosen not to turn away. By the following morning, the island began to divide. No one said they wanted the refugees gone because they hated them. That would have been easier to argue with. They said the clinic needed medicine. They said the school heater was already failing. They said the fishing boats could not go far without fuel. They said children would suffer if the island was cut off. They were right. That was what made it hard. Martin stood in the town hall, which was really a former bait store with benches and a leaking roof. The islanders sat on one side. The refugees stood or sat on crates along the back wall. Saren remained near the door. Nora spoke first. Meridian created this problem. They should restore the cargo line without conditions. A man named Tomas, who ran a small grocery near the harbor, shook his head. And if they do not, we cannot feed everyone on principle. Mara rose slowly. We do not ask you to feed us without helping. We have hands. We have skills. We can repair, clean, fish, carry, build. We only ask not to be sent where our children will grow up owing a debt they cannot repay. The room quieted. Eli stood next. His voice was rough. Maybe we should go. Maybe if Saren goes, the rest of you can stay. We cannot make your island suffer for us. Saren looked at him. You are not a burden because someone wrote you into the wrong category. Eli gave a tired laugh. That is easy for you to say. You understand their system. Her face changed. Martin knew this moment had been coming. Saren stepped into the center of the room. I did understand part of it, she said. Not enough. I worked in a Meridian station. I saw routes change. I told myself it was a computer problem. I told myself someone above me would correct it. I was afraid to lose my wage. I had a younger brother then. I needed my job. Mara closed her eyes. Saren went on. Then a worker transport disappeared. I had watched its route change. I knew why. I copied what I could. I left when they found out. I have spent 2 years trying to guide people around the routes that killed them. Eli looked at her, anger and grief wrestling on his face. You were part of it, he said. Yes. And you want us to trust you. No, Saren said. I want you to know the truth before you decide whether to. Martin watched the room absorb that. No one forgave her immediately. That would have been false. But Doran rose from his crate and leaned on his cane. She came back for my wife, he said. Her own seat was already secured. She turned her ship around when our engine failed. That is why she is here. That is why I am here. Mara nodded. She did not save everyone. None of us could. But she did not leave those she could reach. The meeting ended with no vote and no peace. But that afternoon, Doran repaired the island's old desalination pump with Martin. Mara helped the clinic nurse sort medicines. Eli joined Jace on the dock to mend a torn net. People who had been strangers 3 days earlier worked in silence, then in short exchanges, then in the practical rhythm of labor. Martin spent the afternoon in the Lighthouse basement with Doran. The backup generator sat beneath a tarp in the far corner. It was not much to look at. A squat, heavy machine with a hand-built fuel system and a cracked casing. Martin had bought it years ago in pieces, planning to install it before the next bad winter. It could power the lighthouse for a short time if the main grid failed. It was also the only device on Saint Orra strong enough to punch a signal through Meridian's local control lock. Doran ran his hand over the casing. This could reach the old emergency band, he said, for a few minutes. Enough. If the right people are listening. Doran looked toward the ceiling, with a lighthouse beam turned above them. Your island will lose the light. Martin did not answer. He had known the cost from the moment he opened the tarp. You're home too, Doran said gently. Martin looked at the generator. I know. The cost had been growing in his mind all day, becoming more solid with every ration counted, every child he saw asleep beneath a borrowed blanket, every time the freight barge failed to appear over the horizon. That evening, Martin went to his room and opened the tin box where he kept his savings. There was not much. Enough to fix the roof before winter. Enough to buy fuel if the island's reserve ran low. Money saved in folded bills and marked tokens, because Martin did not trust accounts that could vanish with a wrong code. He carried the box down to Nora's workshop. I need the last drum from the reserve, he said. Nora looked at the box. That is your roof money. I know. Martin, if we wait, Meridian will close the band. Then no one hears anything. Nora looked toward the harbor, where the recovery ship remained offshore. You cannot save everyone by burning your own house down. No, Martin said, but I can save these people from being taken away in the dark. Nora was silent for a long time. Then she took the box. One drum, she said, and I'm coming up that tower with you. The final pressure came at dawn. The official beacon grid around Saint Orra went dark one channel at a time. First, the harbor radios lost their external range. Then the emergency receiver in the lighthouse began to hiss. On the official panel, a new warning announced a regional safety quarantine and stated that unauthorized broadcasts would be blocked. Kellen Voss called again. This is your final opportunity, he said. Turn over Saren Vale and the unregistered arrivals. Supply clearance will resume. Your island will be protected. Martin stood in the lantern room, looking at the beam rotating slowly over the sea. Protected from what? He asked. From consequences you cannot afford. Martin looked down the cliff. He could see the net shed. He could see Mara carrying water buckets. Eli and Jace were moving crates. Saren stood near the dock, looking toward the recovery ship. She had packed a small bag. Martin went down. You're not going, he said. Saren looked at him. If I go, he may leave the others. He may, or he may take you and come back tomorrow for the rest. You cannot know. No, but I know what he calls resettlement. Saren's eyes went to the lighthouse. You will lose everything if you use that generator. I will lose a tower. You will lose your home. Martin looked at the island around them. The wet roofs, the patched boats, the people, carrying blankets and tools between buildings. The refugees who had arrived with nothing and were already helping repair what they could. I have lived in that tower a long time, he said. That does not make it more important than the people standing outside it. Saren lowered her head. Then she looked up with the steady expression Martin had first seen in the storm. There is a narrow gap in Meridian's traffic cycle, she said. They shift premium ships toward the southern ports at mid-morning. Their lock has to open for less than a minute. Can you find it? Yes. Can you make our signal look like something their filters ignore? I think so. Martin nodded. Then we work. The whole island moved before the sun reached the high clouds. Doran and Eli carried tools up the lighthouse stairs. Nora supervised the fuel line. Mara organized a shelter plan in case the tower caught fire. Jace positioned his towboat in the harbor, not to fight the recovery ship, but to keep its launch from coming close without being seen. No one called a battle. It was a repair job under impossible conditions. Martin and Doran opened the generator casing. The copper bridge they had made during the storm would not hold the new load, so Doran rewired the connection with parts taken from an old refrigeration unit. Eli held the lamp and passed tools with shaking but determined hands. Above them, Saren stood in the lantern room with the old receiver, listening to Meridian's pulses. Not yet, she called down. The recovery ship moved closer. Kellen Voss came ashore again, this time with more crew. He stopped at the base of the cliff and looked up at the lighthouse. Martin Hale, he called through a speaker. Do not damage public safety infrastructure. Martin almost laughed. Nora leaned out the side window. You mean the infrastructure you planned to close? Kellen ignored her. Saren's voice came over the internal stairwell. 30 seconds. Martin tightened the last coupling. Fuel seeped over his fingers. The generator gave a deep, ugly cough. 20. Doran looked at Martin. Once it starts, you cannot shut it down clean. I know. Then, Martin pulled the starter. The generator roared. The floor jumped beneath their feet. Every light in the lighthouse flared. The main lens above them brightened until the walls glowed gold. Saren began tapping a pattern into the receiver key. Not words, not a speech. A rescue code older than Meridian, older than the current trade laws, older than the polished ports that had forgotten what it meant to look for a light on a bad night. Martin ran up the stairs two at a time. In the lantern room, the air smelled of hot metal and rain. Saren stood at the panel, her injured hand wrapped around the key. The official screen flooded with warnings that the signal was unauthorized, blocked, and unsafe. Martin pushed the manual wheel and turned the lens west. The beam cut through the storm. Saren fed the signal into the light. The old emergency receiver translated the code into a pattern of flashes. Martin sent the map data through the backup transmitter. Names, coordinates, dates, ship routes, images from the harbor. Every scrap Saren had saved. Below, Kellen's voice rose from a cliff. Stop this now. You are endangering your entire district. A cable sparked. Martin grabbed it with his gloved hand and shoved it back into place. Heat burned through the leather. Keep the pattern going, he said. Saren looked at him. The signal is leaving. Then make it clear. She pressed the key once more. The receiver sent one final message in plain language across every old band channel it could reach. These ships call for help. Who will answer? For several seconds, there was nothing. Only the wind. Only the generator shaking itself toward destruction. Martin felt the old fear rise in him. The fear that he had misread everything. The fear that Kellen had been right about consequences. The fear that Saint Orra would pay for his choice and still be left alone. Then, far across the water, a light blinked. One short. Too long. One short. Martin froze. Another lighthouse, somewhere along the coast, had answered. Nora saw it too. She gave a breathless laugh. Then another light appeared farther south. Then a boat radio crackled in the room below. Jay shouted up the stairs. Fishing vessel Marrow Bay says they have your signal. They are turning north. Another voice came over the radio. A coastal clinic had heard. A cargo skipper had heard. A volunteer rescue station had heard. Old equipment. Small places. People who still kept emergency channels open because no system was perfect and no one worth saving should depend on a perfect system. The answers came not as a crowd, but as points of light. 1, then 2, then 6, then more than Martin could count through the rain. Kellen's recovery ship held position offshore. Its launch turned toward the island, then stopped as the first independent vessels entered the bay. The generator screamed. Doran shouted from below. Martin, the pressure is too high. I know. You have to cut it. Not yet. Saren looked at the transmission meter. The map is only halfway. Martin held the cable in place. The metal burned. The lighthouse lens spun, throwing gold across the clouds. Below them, Saint Orra waited. Saren's voice shook for the first time. Martin, finish it. The generator exploded with a hard, deep sound. The lights went out. For one terrifying heartbeat, the lantern room was black. Then the old lens caught the last of the stored charge and sent one final sweep across the sea. A line of gold. A line that reached the first arriving boat. A line that reached the second. A line that showed every vessel in the bay where Saint Orra was and what it had done. Martin fell against the wall. His hand hurt. Smoke filled the stairwell. Nora and Eli dragged him down. Doran came after them, coughing but upright. Saren was the last to leave the lantern room. Before she stepped out, she looked back at the dead lamp. Then she closed the door gently behind her. By noon, the recovery ship had gone. It did not leave in defeat with sirens or weapons. It left because too many people had arrived, too many radios had recorded the signal, too many hands had copied the coordinates and the names. The map was no longer hidden in one alien woman's bag or one keeper's tower. It belonged to everyone who had seen the lights. The first boats brought fuel, medicine, dry food, and blankets. The second wave brought engineers, clinic workers, and legal volunteers from the coast. The people who came were not powerful in the way Meridian understood power. They were fishers, mechanics, nurses, harbor captains, retired keepers, and families who had heard a call and decided not to ignore it. They came because Martin's light had asked. Saint Orra did not become rich. The roofs still leaked. The sea still cut through the harbor in winter. Martin's room in the lighthouse was blackened by smoke, and the tower stood silent for weeks. But it did not stand alone. Meridian Beacon could not erase the records once the old channels had carried them beyond its network. Investigations began. Freight lines were forced open under public pressure. The recovery routes were questioned. Some officials claimed they had never known. Some said the system had acted automatically. Some said rules needed review. Martin did not care much about their statements. He cared that Mara had medicine for the people in the net shed. He cared that Eli had stopped looking toward the sea as if someone might come to take him away. He cared that Doran had fixed the clinic heater and was now arguing with Nora about the proper way to wire a backup switch. He cared that Saren slept for the first full night in months without holding a map under her coat. In spring, work began on the lighthouse. Not a restoration to what it had been. Something smaller and stronger. The old lamp could not be made whole. Its lens had cracked. Its generator was ruined. But the islanders and refugees built a new signal room beneath the lantern deck. They connected it to old band receivers from coastal stations, hand-cranked transmitters from fishing boats, and simple emergency relays that could not be locked behind payment tiers. They called it Open Light. Saren taught pilots and harbor workers how to read the old rescue pattern. Martin taught them how to keep a generator alive when it wanted to die. Doran trained anyone patient enough to listen on basic repairs. Mara ran the small medical room that grew beside the net shed. Eli helped maintain the signal logs, writing every call down by hand, even when the system recorded it digitally. Paper does not disappear because someone updates a file, Saren told him. Months later, on a clear evening, Martin stood outside the rebuilt lighthouse with a mug of tea warming his hands. The new lamp was smaller than the old one. It did not claim to guide every ship in the sky. It did not need to. It watched the sea. Below, children from Saint Orra and children from the refugee families ran between the repaired boats. Mara called them in before the cold settled. Doran was inside the signal room, complaining that someone had put a tool back in the wrong drawer. Nora was laughing at him. Saren stood beside the receiver table. A soft bell rang. Martin looked up. The old brass bell had been cleaned and hung above the new panel. It rang once, then again. Saren leaned over the receiver. A faint light blinked beyond the horizon. 3 short, 2 long, 1 short. Eli reached for the signal key, then stopped. He looked at Saren. She looked at Martin. Martin did not move toward the key. He only nodded. Saren placed her hand over Eli's, and together they sent the answer. 3 short, 2 long, 1 short. The new lighthouse turned its beam across the darkening water. Far away, a small light changed course. The signal room remained quiet after the answer was sent. Martin listened to the bell settle above them and thought of the first night, when one small sound had made him look up. Outside, the island's windows came on one by one. They were not bright enough to challenge the stars or guide every route in the sky. They were bright enough for the people who needed them. Saint Orra was still a poor island beneath a weathered tower, but it was no longer a closed door. When a frightened signal crossed the water, someone would hear it, and someone would answer. If this story stayed with you, please like, share, and subscribe for more sci-fi stories where courage still matters, where the forgotten are not left behind, and where humanity chooses to keep the light on.